The most uncomfortable truth about the human body is not that it grows old, but that it begins to decline on a timeline it no longer needs. Many people now live far beyond 40, yet the body often starts to weaken before 40, sometimes approaching 40 as if it were already near the end of its useful strength. Muscles recover more slowly, endurance narrows, and small physical limits begin to appear, not because life is ending, but because the body may still be operating on an older expectation that survival beyond 40 was never guaranteed. For most of human history, reaching 40 was not common, and the body may have adapted to invest its strength earlier rather than preserve it beyond that point. Today, even as modern life stretches far past 40, the body can still behave as if 40 remains a boundary it quietly prepares for. And if that is true, then the question becomes difficult to ignore. Why did 90% of humans lose their strength before 40? There is a moment that many people notice without being able to name it clearly. A quiet shift that does not arrive suddenly but seems to gather over time. Often, somewhere before 40, sometimes just approaching 40, where the body begins to feel slightly different from what it once was. Not broken, not failing, but no longer carrying the same ease that used to be taken for granted. Movements that once felt automatic begin to require a trace more attention. Recovery after simple effort stretches a little longer, and strength no longer feels like something that simply exists in the background, but something that must be maintained, watched, and occasionally questioned. This change does not come with a clear signal, no single event marks it, and yet it is widely recognized, as if the body is following a pattern that has been quietly repeating across generations. What makes this moment difficult to understand is not the sensation itself, but the timing, because it often appears before 40, sometimes well before 40, in a period of life that is no longer considered old by modern standards. People today live far beyond 40, often with decades still ahead, and yet the body can begin to act as if it is entering a different phase, one that feels out of proportion to the actual length of life that remains. This creates a subtle contradiction, one that is easy to overlook because it does not disrupt life dramatically, but it reshapes how the body is experienced from within. It raises a question that does not have a simple answer, because it is not only about aging, and it is not only about individual lifestyle, but about something more structural, something that may have been shaped long before modern life extended the human lifespan beyond what it once was. If we look carefully at this feeling of early decline, it does not behave like damage or disease, because it does not follow the patterns of injury, and it does not behave like sudden loss, because it unfolds gradually, almost evenly, across time. Instead, it resembles an adjustment, as if the body is moving toward a state it recognizes, even if the mind does not fully expect it. The idea that strength might begin to fade before 40 challenges the common assumption that the body should remain stable until much later, and this assumption itself may come from the modern experience of extended life, rather than from the conditions under which the human body originally developed. When placed against a longer historical background, the number 40 begins to take on a different meaning, not as a point of decline in the modern sense, but as a threshold that may have once carried more weight in shaping how the body allocates its resources, how it maintains strength, and how it balances effort with recovery. This does not mean that every individual follows the same pattern, and it does not suggest that the body is designed to weaken at a fixed age, but it opens the possibility that what is felt before 40 is not entirely new and not entirely caused by modern habits, but may be connected to older patterns that are still present beneath the surface. In this way, the feeling of becoming weaker before 40 can be understood not as a failure, but as a signal, one that points toward a deeper relationship between the body and the time it was shaped to expect. A time when living far beyond 40 was less common, and when strength may have been distributed differently across the span of life. When the body begins to change in this way, it does not announce itself, and it does not explain its reasons. It simply shifts, quietly, consistently, and often without resistance, leaving the mind to interpret what is happening without a clear reference point. This gap between expectation and experience is where the sense of early decline begins to take form, not as a dramatic loss, but as a slow movement away from a state that once felt stable and toward a state that feels more limited, even when there is still a long life ahead. And it is within this quiet transition that the question begins to deepen, because if the body starts to change before 40, not abruptly, but gradually and predictably, then it suggests that the timing itself may not be accidental, but part of a longer pattern that has yet to be fully understood. The change that begins to appear before 40 often feels personal, as if it belongs only to the individual body, shaped by specific habits, choices, or circumstances. Yet when observed more carefully, it begins to reveal a pattern that extends beyond any single life. Across different places, different cultures, and different ways of living, people often describe a similar transition, a subtle shift in how strength is experienced, how effort is felt, and how recovery unfolds. And this similarity suggests that what happens before 40 may not be entirely random or isolated. It may instead reflect something more consistent, something that has been present across many generations, even if it has taken different forms depending on the environment. When looking back through human history, it becomes difficult to assign precise ages to experiences, because written records are limited and physical evidence speaks in indirect ways. Yet what can be seen is that human life was often shaped by constant physical demand, by movement that did not come in short bursts but continued throughout the day, by environments that did not allow long periods of inactivity, and by conditions that required the body to remain engaged in order to function. Within that kind of life, strength was not something that could be stored for later. It had to be used continuously, adjusted, and rebuilt as part of daily survival. This creates a different baseline for what strength means, not as a peak that is reached and then held, but as a process that is always in motion, rising and falling in response to immediate needs. When this pattern is compared to modern life, a difference begins to emerge, not as a simple contrast between active and inactive, but as a shift in rhythm, where the body is no longer exposed to the same steady demands, and where periods of effort are often separated from periods of rest in ways that may not fully align with how the body developed over time. In this context, the feeling of becoming weaker before 40 can begin to take on a different shape, not as an early failure, but as a response to a rhythm that the body does not entirely recognize. Instead of constant adjustment, the body encounters intervals, starts and stops, moments of exertion followed by extended stillness. And this pattern can influence how strength is maintained, not by removing it directly, but by altering the conditions under which it would normally be sustained. The number 40, in this view, does not act as a fixed boundary, but it becomes a point where the accumulated effects of this altered rhythm begin to be felt more clearly, where small differences that were once unnoticed start to gather into a recognizable change. This does not happen at the same pace for everyone, and it does not follow a strict rule, but it often appears within a similar window of time, suggesting that the body may be responding to long-term patterns rather than immediate causes. If the body was shaped in environments where strength was continuously used and continuously renewed, then a shift away from that pattern could gradually change how strength is experienced, not by removing the ability itself, but by changing the conditions that support it. This would mean that what is felt before 40 is not simply a decline, but a transformation in how the body manages its resources, how it responds to effort, and how it interprets the signals it receives from its surroundings. When these signals differ from those that shape the body over long periods of history, the response may also differ, leading to a form of change that feels unexpected, even though it follows a quiet internal logic. In this way, the sense of weakening before 40 begins to move away from the idea of a personal problem and toward the idea of a shared pattern, one that emerges from the interaction between the body and its environment, and one that becomes visible only when the conditions surrounding the body begin to diverge from those under which it was originally formed. As this pattern becomes more visible, the idea of losing strength before 40 begins to shift once again, not only as a shared experience, but as something that may have always existed in a different form, shaped by conditions that are no longer easy to see. If we move far back, beyond written history, into the long span where human life was guided by environment rather than design, the body did not measure itself against a fixed age. It responded to immediate demands, to terrain, to climate, to the constant need to move, gather, carry, and adapt. In that setting, strength was not preserved in the way it is often imagined today. It was used, continuously, and its presence depended on being part of an ongoing exchange between effort and recovery. When that exchange remained unbroken, the body maintained a kind of balance, not permanent, but stable enough to meet the needs of daily life. Yet, even within this continuity, there were limits, not sharply defined, but shaped by energy, by accumulated strain, and by the simple fact that the body does not hold all of its capacities indefinitely. Without assigning certainty to specific ages, it is still possible to consider that there may have been a period in which the body began to change its priorities, to shift how it distributed its energy, and that this shift could have occurred within a range that includes what we now call 4-0. This would not have been experienced as an early decline, because life itself was structured differently, and expectations were not extended far beyond the conditions of the present. In contrast, modern life introduces a different perspective, where 40 is no longer near the edge of what is expected, but somewhere closer to the middle, and this change in expectation creates a tension between what the body does and what the mind anticipates. The body continues to operate within patterns shaped over long periods, while the surrounding environment suggests a different timeline, one in which strength should remain stable for longer, and where any shift before 40 feels premature. This tension does not produce a sudden conflict, but it gradually reveals itself through small changes, through the way effort feels slightly heavier, through the way recovery stretches, through the way strength no longer feels constant, even when nothing obvious has been lost. These changes do not point to a single cause, and they do not resolve into a simple explanation, but they begin to outline a structure, one in which the body is not failing, but adapting within limits that were not originally set for the conditions it now faces. The idea that 90% of humans may have lost strength before 40 does not need to be taken as a precise measurement to carry meaning. It can instead be understood as a reflection of a broader pattern, one that suggests that early shifts in strength were not unusual within the long arc of human existence. When viewed in this way, the experience of becoming weaker before 40 begins to lose its sense of isolation and becomes part of a larger continuity, one that connects present experience with past conditions, not through exact repetition, but through underlying principles that have remained consistent. The body, in this sense, does not move randomly through time. It follows patterns that were shaped long before modern expectations were formed, and when those expectations extend beyond what the body was prepared to sustain, the result is not immediate failure, but a gradual divergence, a quiet separation between how long we live and how long the body was structured to maintain its strength without adjustment. It is within this separation that the feeling of early decline takes its place, not as a mistake, but as a signal that the relationship between time, strength, and environment is more complex than it first appears, and that the number 40, rather than being an arbitrary marker, may still carry the weight of a much older rhythm that has not fully disappeared. For most people living now, 40 does not feel like an edge of life, and this is one reason the loss of strength before 40 can feel so confusing. Modern life teaches the mind to see 40 as a middle point, a place where much of life still remains, where work, family, memory, responsibility, and identity may still be growing rather than closing. But the human body was not shaped inside that expectation. It was shaped across a much longer and harsher background, in which reaching 40 was not the ordinary midpoint that many people imagine today, and where the path to 40 was crossed by danger, infection, hunger, injury, childbirth, climate, conflict, and simple physical wear. This does not mean that no one lived beyond 40 inches the deep past. Some did. Archaeology, anthropology, and studies of traditional populations all suggest that human beings have long had the capacity to survive into later adulthood when they pass the most dangerous earlier years. But that is different from saying that most bodies could count on long, protected decades after 40. The important point is not a fixed statistic, but the older pressure surrounding the body. Life was uncertain, and the body had to spend its strength early because there was no guarantee that strength saved for later would ever be used. In that world, 40 could carry a very different meaning. It was not necessarily old in the way modern people use the word, but it stood closer to the far side of ordinary survival than to the beginning of a long second half. A body living under those conditions did not need to plan itself around comfort at 60 or independence at 70. It needed to move, carry, climb, endure cold, recover from repeated strain, reproduce, protect children, and remain useful within a demanding environment where the next season mattered more than a distant future. This is where the cold logic of strength begins to appear. The body is not a vault that stores power equally across all decades. It is a living system that allocates energy according to pressure, need, and likelihood. When earlier life carried the highest reproductive and survival importance, more energy could be directed toward growth, fertility, movement, and immediate resilience. Later maintenance mattered, but it competed with everything else. This does not mean the body was designed to collapse at 40. It means that the forces shaping the body may not have strongly favored preserving peak strength far beyond 40 for most people, because the conditions of life did not consistently reward that kind of long preservation. Modern people feel this as a strange unfairness. The mind says there is still so much time left, yet the body begins to show signs of an older bargain. Before 40, strength may still be present, but it may no longer renew with the same ease. Around 40, the difference becomes harder to ignore. After 40, the body often asks for more recovery, more consistency, and more care before it gives the same output. This timing feels premature only because the modern timeline has changed faster than the biological timeline. Lifespans extended through safer birth, cleaner water, better food security, medicine, reduced infectious disease, and social protection, but the underlying body did not become an entirely new organism. It still carries systems formed under older probabilities. The shock is not that strength fades. The shock is that life became longer while the old pattern of bodily investment remained partly intact. When 40 became less like an edge and more like a midpoint, the body did not automatically rewrite the deep rules by which it handles energy, tissue repair, muscle maintenance, and fatigue. So the experience of weakness before 40 may be less a sign that the body has failed, and more a sign that modern time has stretched beyond the older frame in which human strength was once spent. This is why the number 40 matters in this story, not as an exact wall, but as a threshold where two timelines begin to disagree. The timeline of the body, shaped by uncertain survival, and the timeline of modern life, which expects strength to remain available long after the older world would have stopped making promises. When this older timeline is placed beside the modern one, the meaning of 40 begins to separate into two quiet layers that do not fully align. On the surface, 40 appears as a stable point within a long life, supported by systems that reduce risk and extend survival. Beneath that surface, however, the body may still be guided by patterns that formed when reaching 40 was not surrounded by the same level of stability. This difference does not create an immediate conflict, but it shapes how the body manages its resources over time. In earlier environments, survival was uneven, and the body had to operate with uncertainty, responding to immediate demands rather than distant expectations. Strength, in that setting, was part of a continuous exchange with the environment, not a reserve to be protected indefinitely. It was built through use, adjusted through effort, and shaped by conditions that rarely allowed long periods of predictability. Within that kind of life, there was less separation between phases. The body did not clearly divide itself into a long preparation stage, a stable middle, and a gradual decline. Instead, it moved through overlapping cycles of growth, use, strain, and recovery, all within a narrower and less certain frame of time. When 40 appeared within that frame, it was not surrounded by the same assumptions that exist today. It did not represent a secure transition into a long continuation, but rather a point that had already been shaped by years of accumulated exposure to physical demand. This does not suggest that the body was designed to weaken at 40, but it suggests that by the time 40 was reached, the body had already passed through conditions that influenced how strength was maintained. In contrast, modern life creates a different structure. It introduces extended periods of lower physical demand, greater predictability, and the possibility of planning far beyond 40. These changes alter the external timeline, but they do not immediately transform the internal systems that regulate strength. As a result, the body may continue to respond as if it is still operating within a narrower frame, even while the surrounding life has expanded. This creates a quiet tension, not as a visible conflict, but as a gradual mismatch between expectation and response. The mind anticipates continuity, while the body begins to shift its balance. This shift is not abrupt, and it does not follow a single cause. It emerges slowly, as the accumulated effects of altered conditions begin to influence how strength is experienced. Before 40, this may appear as small variations that are easy to overlook. Around 40, these variations often become more noticeable, not because something new has suddenly begun, but because the underlying pattern has reached a point where it can no longer remain hidden within daily activity. This pattern does not need to be exact or universal to carry meaning. It is enough that it appears across different lives with a similar shape, suggesting that the body may be following a broader logic that is not fully aligned with modern expectations. When strength begins to feel less stable before 40, it may not be responding only to immediate lifestyle, but to the interaction between long-formed biological tendencies and newly extended timelines. The number 40, in this context, becomes a place where this interaction becomes visible. It is not a fixed boundary, but it acts as a point where the difference between past conditions and present conditions becomes easier to sense. The body does not declare this difference, and it does not explain its timing, but it expresses it through subtle changes in how effort is sustained and how recovery unfolds. These changes do not point toward a single conclusion, but they suggest that the experience of weakening before 40 may be part of a deeper structure, one that reflects how the body continues to operate within patterns that were formed when time itself was shaped by different constraints, and when reaching 40 carried a different weight than it does now. When this difference in timelines is followed to its quiet conclusion, the role of 40 becomes less about a specific age and more about a point where accumulated conditions begin to show their effect in a way that can no longer remain unnoticed. The body does not mark this point with a clear signal, and it does not treat 40 as a fixed boundary, yet the pattern that surrounds it suggests that something gradual has been building long before it is consciously recognized. If the body was shaped within a world where survival required continuous engagement with physical demand, then each year carried a certain weight, not as a number, but as a sequence of exposures that influenced how strength was used and renewed. Over time, these exposures would not simply disappear. They would leave traces, small adjustments in tissue, in energy distribution, in how effort is balanced with recovery. By the time an individual approached what we now call 40, these adjustments may have already formed a structure within the body, one that reflects years of interaction with a demanding environment. This does not imply that the body was intended to decline at that moment, but it suggests that by that stage, strength was already shaped by a long sequence of use, rather than preserved in a steady, untouched state. In earlier conditions, this would not have appeared as a sudden change, because expectations were aligned with the environment. The body was not compared to a future that extended far beyond immediate survival, and so any gradual shift in strength would have been absorbed into the flow of daily life. In contrast, modern life introduces a different expectation, one that extends the sense of continuity far beyond what earlier conditions would have supported. When this extended expectation meets a body that still carries traces of older patterns, the result is not immediate conflict, but a subtle divergence. The body continues to operate according to processes shaped over long periods, while the surrounding environment suggests that those processes should behave differently. This divergence becomes more visible as time passes, not because the body suddenly changes at 40, but because the accumulation of small differences reaches a level where it begins to affect how strength is experienced in everyday activity. Before 40, these differences may remain within the background, noticeable only in brief moments. Around 40, they often become more consistent, appearing across different forms of effort, suggesting that the underlying pattern has become more stable. After 40, the body may continue along this path, not as a collapse, but as an extension of the same gradual process. This continuity is important, because it shows that the experience of losing strength before 40 is not an isolated event, but part of a longer progression that began much earlier. The number 40, then, serves as a point where this progression becomes easier to perceive, not because it creates the change, but because it reveals what has already been forming beneath the surface. When considered in this way, the idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 does not need to be understood as a precise measure. It can instead be seen as an expression of a broader tendency, one that reflects how the body distributes its resources across time under varying conditions. The key is not whether every individual follows the same pattern, but that the pattern itself appears often enough to suggest a shared underlying structure. This structure does not belong to a single era, and it does not disappear when life becomes longer. It remains present, adjusting to new conditions while still carrying elements of its earlier formation. As modern life continues to extend the length of human experience, this underlying structure may become more visible, not because it has changed, but because the distance between expectation and response has widened. In that widening space, the experience of weakening before 40 begins to take on a different meaning, not as an early ending, but as a point where the body reveals how it has been shaped by a past that still influences the present, even when the surrounding world has moved beyond the conditions that first defined it. If the body is not designed to preserve strength evenly across all decades, then the question shifts from when strength is lost to how it is used in the first place. The human body does not treat energy as an unlimited resource. It distributes it, quietly and continuously, across different needs that compete with one another over time. Growth, movement, repair, immune defense, reproduction, and basic survival all draw from the same underlying system, and the way this system allocates its resources is shaped by long periods of adaptation, rather than by modern expectations of longevity. When looking at life before stable agriculture, before consistent shelter, before reliable food storage, the body operated within conditions where energy could not be assumed to be available at all times. Food supply fluctuated, physical effort was unavoidable, and environmental stress was a constant presence. In that setting, the body could not afford to invest its resources evenly across a long and predictable future. It had to prioritize immediate function, maintaining the ability to move, to respond, and to reproduce within a window of time that was uncertain and often limited. This creates a different logic of strength, one that is not centered on long-term preservation, but on timely use. Strength, in this sense, becomes something that is spent as much as it is maintained, shaped by the need to meet present demands, rather than to safeguard distant ones. When this pattern is carried forward into the modern world, it does not disappear simply because conditions have changed. The body continues to allocate energy according to systems that were formed under older pressures, even if those pressures are no longer present in the same way. As a result, strength may not be held in reserve as long as modern life assumes it should be. Instead, it may be directed toward earlier phases of life, toward growth, toward activity, toward reproduction, and toward maintaining function in a way that reflects older priorities. By the time the body approaches 40, much of this allocation has already taken place. This does not mean that strength is exhausted, but it suggests that the balance has shifted, that the body is no longer distributing its resources in the same way it did earlier. Recovery may require more time, not because the body is failing, but because its internal priorities have adjusted. Muscle maintenance may require more consistent input, not because the capacity has vanished, but because the conditions that once supported it automatically are no longer present in the same form. The number 40 becomes relevant here not as a strict boundary, but as a point where these shifts become easier to observe. Before 40, the body often compensates for changes without drawing attention to them. Around 40, the accumulated effects of earlier allocation begin to surface, making the underlying pattern more visible. This pattern does not imply a universal rule, and it does not define a fixed outcome, but it suggests that the body may have been shaped to use its strength earlier, rather than to preserve it indefinitely. When modern life extends the timeline far beyond what earlier conditions supported, this earlier investment becomes more noticeable, creating the impression that strength is being lost prematurely. In reality, it may be following a distribution that once matched a different kind of life, one where the future was less certain and where energy had to be used when it was most needed, rather than saved for a time that might never arrive. When energy is directed toward earlier phases of life, the change that appears before 40 begins to feel less like an unexpected decline, and more like the result of a long process that has already taken place. The body does not suddenly decide to reduce its strength as it approaches 40. Instead, it has been making small decisions over many years, adjusting how it uses and restores its resources in response to signals that have guided it for a long time. These signals are not conscious, and they are not fixed to a single environment, but they reflect patterns shaped when survival depended on responding quickly to immediate conditions rather than preserving capacity for a distant future. In those earlier conditions, the body could not rely on stability. Food could be scarce. Physical effort was often required without preparation, and recovery had to occur within the flow of daily life rather than during long periods of rest. Under such circumstances, energy was not simply saved for later. It was used, redistributed, and rebalanced continuously, with the understanding at a biological level that future conditions could not be guaranteed. This way of operating leaves a lasting imprint, one that continues to influence how the body behaves even when the surrounding world becomes more stable. As life extends beyond 40 inches modern conditions, the body carries forward a pattern that was not originally structured for such an extended timeline. It does not stop functioning, and it does not lose its ability to adapt, but it continues to distribute its resources in a way that reflects earlier priorities. By the time a person reaches 40, much of the body's long-term allocation has already been shaped by years of use, repair, and adaptation. This does not mean that strength disappears at 40, but it suggests that the ease with which strength is maintained may change because the underlying balance has shifted. Before 40, the body often compensates quietly, adjusting to variations in effort and recovery without making those adjustments noticeable. Around 40, these compensations may become less seamless, not because the body has lost its capacity, but because the accumulated effects of earlier allocation begin to require more deliberate support. The environment in which the body now exists may no longer provide the continuous input that once sustained strength automatically. Instead of constant movement, there may be periods of stillness. Instead of gradual recovery, there may be abrupt transitions between effort and rest. These changes alter how the body manages its resources, and over time, they influence how strength is experienced. The number 40 becomes a point where this influence becomes clearer, not because it creates the change, but because it reveals the outcome of a process that has been unfolding for years. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this context as a reflection of how energy is distributed over time. It is not a precise measure, and it does not apply in the same way to every individual, but it points toward a tendency that emerges when the body operates under patterns shaped by earlier conditions. In a world where the future was uncertain, using strength early was a practical response. In a world where life extends far beyond 40, that same pattern can appear as an early reduction, even though it follows a logic that was once aligned with survival. The body, in this sense, is not failing to meet modern expectations. It is continuing to operate within a framework that was formed when time itself was structured differently, and when the balance between present use and future preservation was shaped by conditions that no longer fully exist. When this long pattern of allocation is followed further, the idea of strength itself begins to change, not as something fixed that is either present or absent, but as something that depends on how it has been used over time. The body does not hold strength in a single place, and it does not preserve it in a uniform way. It is distributed across systems that are constantly adjusting, responding to demand, to rest, to availability of energy, and to signals that reflect both immediate conditions and deeper patterns formed over long periods. In earlier environments where movement was continuous and survival depended on consistent engagement, this distribution remained active, always in use, always in renewal. Strength was not separated from daily life. It was embedded within it, shaped by walking, carrying, climbing, and adapting to uneven ground and changing weather. Under those conditions, the body did not need to decide when to use its strength, because it was always part of the ongoing exchange between effort and recovery. When that exchange remained uninterrupted, the body maintained a form of balance, not permanent, but stable enough to support daily function. In contrast, modern life introduces a different structure, one in which strength is often separated from routine activity. Movement may occur in defined periods, while the rest of the day remains relatively still. Effort may be concentrated rather than continuous, and recovery may take place in ways that do not fully align with the patterns that shape the body over time. This shift does not remove the capacity for strength, but it changes the conditions under which it is maintained. When strength is no longer part of a continuous process, it becomes more dependent on deliberate input, and when that input is inconsistent, the distribution of strength across the body begins to shift. Over time, this shift can become more noticeable, especially as the body approaches 40, not because something new has suddenly occurred, but because the effects of this altered pattern have had time to accumulate. Before 40, the body often compensates for these changes, maintaining function even when the underlying distribution is gradually adjusting. Around 40, these compensations may become less complete, making the changes more visible in everyday experience. This does not mean that strength has disappeared, but it may feel less stable, less automatic, and more dependent on how the body is engaged. The number 40 becomes significant in this context, not as a strict limit, but as a point where the balance between use and preservation has shifted enough to be felt more consistently. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood as a reflection of this shift, where strength that was once continuously reinforced becomes more variable when the conditions that supported it are no longer present in the same form. This interpretation does not rely on precise measurement, and it does not assume a uniform experience, but it suggests that the body responds to patterns of use over long periods, and that when those patterns change, the experience of strength changes with them. In a world where movement was constant, strength was maintained through participation in that movement. In a world where movement is intermittent, strength may require more deliberate maintenance, and without it, the body may gradually adjust to a lower baseline. This adjustment does not occur suddenly, and it does not follow a single cause, but it becomes more visible as time passes, especially around 40, when the accumulated effects of earlier patterns begin to shape how the body feels and responds. In this way, the experience of losing strength before 40 can be seen not as a simple decline, but as the outcome of how strength has been distributed, used, and supported over time, within a system that continues to follow principles formed long before the structure of modern life extended the timeline in which those principles now operate. When strength is shaped by continuous use, the structure of the body begins to reflect the conditions under which that use takes place. Muscles do not exist independently of movement, and they do not maintain themselves without being engaged. Their form, their responsiveness, and even their capacity to recover are influenced by how regularly they are called into action. In environments where movement was constant, the body did not separate physical effort from ordinary life. Walking across uneven ground, carrying weight without fixed tools, adjusting posture to changing terrain, and responding to cold or heat all required ongoing muscular involvement. These actions were not intense in isolation, but they were repeated across the day, forming a pattern of low but persistent demand. Within that pattern, muscles were not built only for moments of high output. They were shaped to endure, to remain active over long periods, and to adjust continuously without long interruptions. This creates a type of strength that is not easily noticed because it does not depend on peaks. It depends on continuity. When this continuity is maintained, the body does not need to rebuild strength from a resting state. It remains within a state of readiness, where engagement and recovery overlap rather than occur in separate phases. In contrast, when movement becomes intermittent, the body encounters a different pattern. Muscles may be used intensely for short periods and then left inactive for extended stretches of time. This separation changes how the body maintains its internal balance. Instead of constant adjustment, there are cycles of activation and inactivity, and these cycles can influence how muscle tissue is supported. Without continuous input, the body may reduce the resources it allocates to maintaining muscle, not as a failure, but as a response to reduced demand. Over time, this response can alter how strength is experienced, making it feel less stable and more dependent on deliberate effort. Before 40, the body often compensates for these changes, maintaining function even when the underlying pattern has shifted. Around 40, the effects of this shift may become more visible, not because muscles suddenly lose their capacity, but because the accumulated difference between continuous use and intermittent use has reached a point where it can be felt more clearly. This does not imply that muscles are designed to weaken at 40, but it suggests that the way they are maintained interacts with time in a way that reflects long-term patterns of use. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where these patterns begin to show their effect more consistently, especially when the conditions that once supported continuous movement are no longer present. In earlier human environments, the body rarely experienced long periods without physical engagement. Even rest occurred within a context that required readiness, where the next movement could come without warning. This kept the muscular system active in a way that did not rely on deliberate exercise. In modern settings, where rest can be extended and movement can be optional, the body may adjust to a lower baseline of activity, gradually shifting how muscle is maintained. This shift does not remove strength immediately, but it changes the balance between use and preservation, making strength more sensitive to how often it is engaged. When this sensitivity is combined with the long-term allocation of energy described earlier, the experience of weakening before 40 begins to take on a clearer structure. It is not a sudden loss, and it is not caused by a single factor, but it reflects how the body responds over time to patterns that differ from those under which it was originally shaped. The muscles in this sense are not failing to perform. They are adapting to a different rhythm, one that may not provide the continuous input required to sustain the same level of strength without additional effort. And it is within this change of rhythm that the early signs of decline begin to appear, often before 40, not as a break, but as a gradual adjustment that becomes more noticeable as the body moves further along its internal timeline. When muscles are no longer engaged through continuous movement, the way they are supported begins to change in ways that are not always visible at first. The body does not remove strength abruptly, and it does not reduce muscle function without reason. Instead, it adjusts gradually, responding to the signals it receives from daily activity. In environments where movement was constant, those signals were clear and steady. Muscles were used across a wide range of small actions, from maintaining balance on uneven ground to carrying objects over distance, and these repeated demands created a consistent pattern of activation. Within that pattern, the body maintained muscle tissue not only because it was useful, but because it was continuously required. This requirement acted as a form of instruction, guiding the body to sustain the structures that supported movement. When this instruction becomes less frequent, the body does not interpret it as a temporary change. Over time, it begins to adjust its internal priorities. Maintaining muscle requires energy, and if the signals that justify that investment become irregular, the body may gradually shift how much energy it dedicates to that system. This shift is not a failure, but a response to changing conditions. In modern life, where long periods of stillness can occur between moments of effort, the signals that once guided continuous muscle maintenance become less stable. The body receives mixed information, periods of inactivity followed by short bursts of use, and it adapts by adjusting the baseline rather than maintaining the same level of readiness at all times. Before 40, this adjustment is often subtle. The body compensates, preserving function even when the underlying support has begun to change. Muscles still respond, strength can still be used, and the difference between past and present may only appear in brief moments, such as a slower recovery or a slight reduction in endurance. Around 40, these small differences begin to connect. What once appeared as isolated variations becomes a more consistent experience, not because the body has suddenly lost its ability, but because the cumulative effect of altered signals has reached a point where it can no longer remain hidden within normal activity. This does not imply that 40 is a fixed point of change, but it often acts as a stage where the consequences of long-term patterns become easier to observe. In earlier human environments, the body rarely experienced this kind of separation between use and non-use. Even during periods of rest, the need for readiness remained, and movement could resume without delay. This created a continuous relationship between muscles and the environment, where activation and recovery were not isolated processes. In contrast, when modern conditions allow extended disengagement, the body may begin to treat muscle maintenance differently, not because it is incapable of sustaining it, but because the conditions no longer consistently demand it. This leads to a gradual shift in how strength is distributed and preserved. The number 40 becomes relevant within this process, as a point where the accumulated effects of these shifts begin to align in a noticeable way. The body, having adjusted over years to a pattern of intermittent signals, expresses that adjustment through a change in how strength feels and responds. It is not a collapse, and it is not a sudden loss, but it is a transition that reflects how the body has adapted to its environment over time. When this transition is understood in relation to long-term patterns of movement and energy allocation, the experience of weakening before 40 becomes less about a single cause and more about the interaction between the body's original design and the conditions in which it now operates, a relationship that continues to shape how strength is maintained, even as the surrounding world changes in ways that extend life far beyond what earlier patterns were formed to support. As these shifts continue over time, The relationship between muscle and movement becomes less automatic and more dependent on how the body is guided through its environment. In earlier conditions, muscles did not need to be reminded to stay active. The demands of daily life provided that reminder without interruption. Every step across uneven ground required adjustment, every object carried added resistance, and even resting positions often involved subtle engagement to maintain balance or respond to the surrounding conditions. This created a constant dialogue between the body and its environment, where muscles were not only used, but continuously informed about their necessity. When that dialogue weakens, the body does not react immediately, but it gradually changes how it interprets the need for maintaining strength. Without steady input, the signals that once reinforced muscle engagement become less consistent, and the body begins to operate with a different expectation. It does not assume that strength will be required at all times, and as a result, it may reduce the resources it allocates to sustaining it at a higher level. This reduction is not sudden, and it does not remove the capacity for strength, but it alters the baseline from which strength is expressed. Before 40, the body often manages this transition quietly. Muscles remain capable, and the difference between earlier and later function may only appear under certain conditions, such as prolonged effort or unfamiliar tasks. Around 40, the accumulated effect of this altered baseline becomes more visible. The body may still perform, but the ease with which it does so has shifted, and this shift reflects the long-term change in how muscles have been engaged and supported. The number 40, in this context, becomes a point where the body's adaptation to intermittent signals reaches a level that is more consistently felt, not because it marks a beginning, but because it reveals the outcome of a gradual process. This process is shaped by the absence of continuous dialogue between the body and its environment, a dialogue that once ensured that muscle maintenance remained an ongoing priority. In modern conditions, where movement can be optional and where the environment often reduces the need for constant adjustment, this dialogue becomes less active, and the body adapts accordingly. It learns to function with less continuous engagement, and over time, this learning influences how strength is maintained. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this framework as a reflection of how the body responds when the signals that once guided continuous muscle use become irregular. It is not that the body is unable to sustain strength, but that it adjusts to what it perceives as necessary. When necessity is reduced, the body may lower its baseline, conserving energy for other functions while still retaining the ability to respond when needed. This creates a form of strength that is more situational, less constant, and more dependent on how the body is used over time. As life extends beyond 40, this adjustment becomes more noticeable, because the period during which strength is expected to remain stable has expanded, while the underlying patterns that govern muscle maintenance have not fully shifted to match that expansion. The result is a gradual divergence between expectation and experience, where the body continues to follow a rhythm shaped by continuous engagement, even as the environment offers fewer reasons to maintain that rhythm. It is within this divergence that the early signs of decline take form, not as a failure of the body, but as an expression of how it has adapted to a different kind of world, one where the conditions that once sustained strength without interruption are no longer present in the same way, and where the meaning of 40 has changed in the mind without fully changing in the body. In a world where movement was constant, recovery did not exist as a separate phase that followed effort. It was woven directly into the flow of activity itself. The body did not alternate sharply between exertion and rest, but instead moved through a continuous spectrum of engagement, where periods of lower intensity allowed restoration to occur without complete inactivity. Walking after carrying, adjusting pace after climbing, shifting posture while resting on uneven ground, all of these created a rhythm in which the body could recover while still remaining active. This pattern meant that recovery was not something that had to be scheduled or isolated. It happened as part of living, guided by subtle changes in effort rather than by complete withdrawal from movement. Within this structure, the body maintained a balance that did not rely on long periods of stillness. Muscles, joints, and connective tissues were constantly receiving low-level stimulation, and this ongoing input supported the processes that keep the body functional over time. When recovery is embedded in movement, the body does not need to rebuild itself from a fully inactive state. It remains in a condition where repair and use overlap, reducing the gap between effort and restoration. In contrast, Modern life often separates these processes. Activity is placed into defined intervals, and recovery is treated as something that requires complete rest or inactivity. This separation changes how the body experiences both effort and restoration. When movement is concentrated into short periods, it can place higher stress on tissues that are not continuously prepared for that demand. When recovery is extended into long periods of stillness, the body may not receive the low-level signals that support gradual repair. This creates a pattern in which the body must move between two distinct states, active and inactive, rather than remaining within a continuous flow. Over time, this pattern can influence how recovery feels and how effective it is. Before 40, the body often adapts to these conditions, maintaining its ability to recover even when the underlying rhythm has changed. Small delays in recovery may appear, but they are often absorbed into daily life without drawing attention. As the body approaches 40, these delays may become more noticeable, not because recovery has suddenly become inadequate, but because the cumulative effect of repeated interruptions has altered how the body manages restoration. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the difference between continuous recovery and interrupted recovery becomes easier to sense. In earlier conditions, the body rarely experienced long periods of complete disengagement from movement. Even rest involved subtle adjustments that kept the system active. This continuous engagement supported a form of recovery that was distributed across time, rather than concentrated in specific moments. When that distribution changes, the body must adapt, and part of that adaptation may involve slower or less efficient recovery under certain conditions. This does not indicate that the body is losing its ability to repair itself, but it suggests that the way recovery is supported has shifted. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood in part through this change in recovery patterns. If the body is no longer recovering in the way it was shaped to do, then the balance between use and restoration may gradually shift, leading to a feeling of reduced strength over time. This feeling is not the result of a single event, but of many small interruptions that accumulate, altering the rhythm that once allowed the body to maintain itself without clear boundaries between effort and rest. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 begins to reflect not only how strength is used, but how it is restored. Within a system that continues to follow patterns formed in a world where recovery was never separate from movement, and where the body remained in a constant state of quiet adjustment, even when it appeared to be at rest. When recovery becomes something that happens only after activity rather than during it, the body begins to experience a different kind of rhythm, one that it may not fully recognize. Instead of moving through a continuous flow where effort and restoration overlap, it is placed into a pattern of separation, where activity is followed by stillness, and stillness is expected to repair what activity has disrupted. This expectation can work under certain conditions, but it changes how the body manages its internal balance. In earlier environments, recovery was guided by constant feedback. The body adjusted its level of effort in response to fatigue, slowing down, shifting posture, or changing movement in ways that allowed restoration to occur without complete disengagement. This meant that recovery was responsive and immediate, closely tied to the body's current state rather than postponed to a later time. When this pattern is replaced by a system where recovery is delayed or isolated, the body must adapt to a new set of signals. It no longer receives the same continuous feedback that once guided its adjustments, and instead, it experiences more abrupt transitions between use and rest. These transitions can influence how efficiently recovery takes place, not because the body has lost its ability to repair, but because the conditions under which repair occurs have changed. When activity is intense and followed by long periods of inactivity, the body may need more time to restore balance, and this additional time can become more noticeable as years pass. Before 40, the body often compensates for this change, maintaining its ability to recover even when the rhythm is less continuous. Small differences may appear, such as a need for slightly longer rest or a feeling of incomplete recovery after certain efforts, but these differences are often subtle enough to remain within the background of daily life. Around 40, these differences may begin to accumulate, creating a more consistent sense that recovery is no longer as immediate or as complete as it once was. This does not indicate a sudden decline, but it reflects the outcome of a long-term adjustment to a different pattern of activity and rest. The number 40 becomes significant in this context, as a point where the accumulated effects of separated recovery begin to be felt more clearly. The body, having adapted over years to a rhythm that differs from its original pattern, expresses this adaptation through changes in how it restores itself after effort. In earlier conditions, recovery was not something that required special attention. It occurred naturally as part of movement, supported by the continuous engagement of muscles and tissues. In modern conditions, recovery may require more deliberate management, not because the body is less capable, but because the environment no longer provides the same level of continuous support. This shift can influence how strength is maintained over time. If recovery becomes less efficient or more dependent on specific conditions, then the balance between use and restoration may gradually change, leading to a feeling that strength is not being fully restored between periods of effort. This feeling becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative impact of these changes reaches a point where it affects daily experience. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be partially understood through this lens, where the separation of recovery from movement alters the way the body maintains its capacity over time. It is not that recovery stops working, but that it works within a different structure, one that may not fully align with the patterns that originally supported continuous renewal. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not only how strength is used, but how it is restored within a system that has adapted to a new rhythm, one that introduces gaps where there were once connections, and that changes the flow of recovery in ways that become more visible as time passes. When recovery is separated from movement over long periods of time, the body does not simply accept this new structure without adjustment. It begins to reorganize how it interprets effort, fatigue, and restoration. In a continuous environment, fatigue served as a guide, not as a signal to stop completely, but as an instruction to change pace, shift posture, or reduce intensity while remaining active. This allowed the body to remain within a narrow range where recovery could occur alongside use, maintaining a steady internal balance. When that guiding system is replaced by a pattern of stopping and starting, fatigue takes on a different meaning. It becomes associated with the end of activity rather than a modulation within it, and this changes how the body responds to both effort and rest. Instead of adjusting gradually, the body moves between more defined states, and this can influence how efficiently it returns to balance after each period of use. Over time, this shift in interpretation can alter the body's sensitivity to effort. Movements that once fell within a continuous range may now feel more demanding, not because they require more absolute energy, but because they occur within a system that is less accustomed to maintaining steady engagement. Recovery, in turn, may feel less complete, not because it has stopped functioning, but because it is no longer supported by the same ongoing processes that once sustained it. Before 40, the body often adapts to this pattern without making the change obvious. It continues to respond, to recover, and to maintain function, even when the underlying structure has shifted. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of repeated transitions between activity and inactivity begins to shape how the body feels on a more consistent basis. Fatigue may appear earlier, recovery may seem less immediate, and strength may feel more variable, not because of a sudden decline, but because the body has spent years adjusting to a rhythm that differs from the one it was shaped to follow. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where these long-term adjustments become more visible, where the difference between continuous recovery and interrupted recovery is no longer hidden within short-term fluctuations. In earlier human environments, the body rarely experienced long interruptions in movement. Even during rest, subtle activity continued, supporting circulation, muscle tone, and joint stability. This ongoing activity created a form of recovery that did not rely on complete disengagement, allowing the body to remain in a state of readiness without needing to rebuild from a fully inactive state. When this pattern is replaced by extended stillness, the body must repeatedly transition between inactivity and activity, and each transition carries a small cost, not in isolation, but in accumulation. Over years, these small costs can influence how strength is maintained, gradually shifting the balance between use and restoration. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this accumulation, where the separation of recovery from movement creates a series of small interruptions that, over time, alter how the body manages its resources. This does not suggest that the body is unable to adapt, but it highlights that adaptation occurs within a framework shaped by earlier conditions. When the structure of recovery changes, the body adjusts, but the result may not fully match modern expectations of continuous strength across extended lifespans. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not a single cause, but the outcome of many small shifts in how effort and recovery are connected, shifts that become more apparent as the body moves further along its internal timeline, and as the difference between past patterns and present conditions continues to influence how strength is sustained over time. In earlier human environments, the body rarely experienced true interruption, not in the way it is understood today. There were pauses, there were moments of lower activity, but these were not the same as complete disengagement. The body remained involved, subtly active, even when it appeared to be resting. Sitting on uneven ground required constant adjustment. Lying down on natural surfaces did not fully remove the need for muscular support, and remaining aware of the surroundings meant that the body never entered a state of total separation from movement. This created a continuous background of low-level activity that kept the body engaged without demanding intense effort. Within this continuity, the body did not need to restart itself repeatedly. It remained within a range where transitions between effort and recovery were smooth, almost unnoticeable. When movement increased, the body was already prepared. When movement decreased, the body did not fully shut down. This steady state allowed strength to be maintained without sharp contrasts between activity and inactivity. In contrast, modern life introduces a different structure, one in which interruption becomes more pronounced. Long periods of sitting, lying on supportive surfaces that remove the need for muscular engagement, and environments that reduce the need for constant adjustment all contribute to a pattern where the body can enter deeper states of inactivity. These states are not harmful in isolation, but they change how the body manages its readiness. Instead of remaining within a continuous range, the body may move between more distinct levels of engagement, shifting from low activity to high activity, with less time spent in between. This shift creates a different kind of demand on the body, one that requires it to restart processes that were once continuously maintained. Before 40, the body often handles these restarts without drawing attention to them. Muscles engage, circulation increases, coordination adjusts, and the system returns to function. Around 40, however, the repeated need to transition between inactive and active states may begin to feel less seamless. Movements that once felt immediate may require a moment to settle, and the body may take slightly longer to reach the same level of responsiveness. This does not indicate a loss of ability, but it reflects the accumulated effect of repeated interruptions over time. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the body's adaptation to these interruptions becomes more consistently noticeable. In earlier conditions, the absence of long interruptions meant that the body did not need to frequently re-establish its readiness. It remained within a state where engagement was continuous, and transitions were gradual. In modern conditions where interruption is more common, the body must repeatedly adjust, moving from inactivity to activity and back again. Each of these transitions carries a small cost, not in isolation, but in accumulation. Over years, this accumulation can influence how strength is experienced, making it feel less immediate and more dependent on how the body is prepared. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this framework as a reflection of how the body responds to repeated interruption. It is not that strength disappears, but that the conditions required to express it become more specific. When the body is continuously engaged, strength is readily available. When engagement is interrupted, strength may still exist, but it may require more time or more preparation to access. This difference becomes more apparent as the body approaches 40, when the accumulated effects of interruption have had time to shape how the system responds. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not only how strength is used and restored, but how consistently the body remains engaged with its environment, within a system that was shaped to operate without long breaks, and that continues to carry that expectation even as the structure of daily life changes. When interruption becomes a regular part of daily life, the body begins to adapt not only to movement, but to the absence of movement itself. It learns how to enter states of reduced activity more deeply, and how to remain there for longer periods without immediate demand. This adaptation is not inherently negative, but it changes how the body prepares for effort. In a continuous environment, preparation is always present. The body does not need to shift from rest to readiness, because it never fully leaves that state. Muscles remain lightly engaged, joints are subtly active, and the systems that support movement operate at a low but steady level. When interruption becomes more pronounced, this baseline changes. The body allows itself to settle into a lower state of engagement, one that conserves energy but also reduces immediate readiness. As a result, when movement resumes, the body must re-establish processes that were once maintained continuously. This re-establishment does not happen instantly, and over time, the repeated need to transition between these states can influence how strength is experienced. Before 40, these transitions are often smooth enough that they do not draw attention. The body moves from inactivity to activity with little hesitation, and any delay in readiness is absorbed into the background of daily experience. Around 40, the accumulated effect of repeated transitions may begin to appear more clearly. The body may take slightly longer to respond, not because it has lost its capacity, but because the systems that support movement have been allowed to settle more deeply during periods of inactivity. This creates a subtle difference in how strength feels, not as a loss, but as a change in how easily it is accessed. The number 40 becomes relevant in this context as a point where the cumulative impact of these deeper interruptions becomes more noticeable. In earlier human environments, the body was rarely allowed to enter such prolonged states of disengagement. Even during rest, there was a need to remain aware, to adjust to the ground, to respond to the environment, and to be ready to move if necessary. This maintained a level of engagement that supported immediate responsiveness. In modern conditions, where safety and stability allow for deeper rest, the body adapts by reducing its baseline level of activity. This adaptation conserves energy, but it also changes how the body transitions back into movement. Over time, the repeated pattern of entering and exiting these deeper states can influence how strength is expressed. It may still be present, but it may require more time or more consistent engagement to reach the same level of function. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this gradual shift, where the body's adaptation to deeper interruption leads to a change in how strength is accessed and maintained. It is not that the body becomes incapable, but that the pathway to strength becomes less direct, shaped by the need to re-engage systems that were once continuously active. This process does not occur suddenly, and it does not follow a single cause, but it becomes more visible as time passes, particularly around 40, when the accumulation of repeated interruptions has had enough time to influence the body's baseline state. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects how the body responds to a different rhythm of engagement, one that includes deeper and more frequent interruptions, and that gradually alters the ease with which strength can be expressed within a system that was originally shaped to operate without such clear separations between activity and rest. As this pattern continues, the body does not simply become less active, it begins to reorganize how it understands the need for readiness itself. In an environment without long interruptions, readiness was not something that had to be regained. It was a constant background state, supported by continuous low-level engagement. The body did not wait for a signal to prepare, because preparation never fully stopped. When interruption becomes frequent and prolonged, this constant state is replaced by a more conditional one. The body begins to treat readiness as something that is only required at certain times, rather than as a continuous necessity. This shift changes how the systems that support movement are maintained. Muscles, coordination, balance, and even the subtle timing of movement begin to depend more on recent activity rather than on an ongoing baseline. When activity resumes after a period of inactivity, the body must re-establish this coordination, and while it is capable of doing so, the process may no longer feel immediate. Before 40, this change often remains within a range that does not disrupt daily function. The body adjusts quickly enough that the difference is barely noticeable. Around 40, the accumulated effect of repeated disengagement and re-engagement may begin to shape how readiness is experienced more consistently. Movements that once felt automatic may require a moment of adjustment, and the body may feel less prepared to respond without some form of gradual activation. This does not indicate a loss of strength, but it reflects a change in how strength is accessed, influenced by the long-term pattern of interruption. The number 40 becomes significant here, as a point where the effects of this pattern become more stable and easier to perceive. In earlier human environments, the absence of prolonged interruption meant that the body rarely needed to rebuild its readiness. It remained within a continuous state of engagement, where transitions between different levels of effort were smooth and required little adjustment. In modern conditions, where interruption is built into the structure of daily life, the body adapts by allowing itself to enter deeper states of disengagement, and this adaptation changes how quickly it can return to full function. Each transition from inactivity to activity requires the body to re-establish coordination, to increase circulation, and to restore the subtle connections that support movement. These processes are efficient, but they are not without cost when repeated over many years. The accumulation of these small costs can influence how strength is experienced, not by reducing its capacity, but by altering the conditions under which it is expressed. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this framework as a reflection of how the body responds to a life structured around interruption. It is not that the body is unable to maintain strength, but that the pathway to maintaining it has become less continuous and more dependent on how often the body is brought back into an engaged state. When readiness is no longer constant, strength becomes more variable, and this variability becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of repeated disengagement has had enough time to influence the baseline from which movement begins. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects a deeper shift in how the body organizes its readiness, shaped by a rhythm that includes clear separations between activity and inactivity, and that gradually alters the ease with which strength can be expressed within a system that was originally formed to remain in motion without long breaks. In earlier human environments, the ground itself was never neutral. It was uneven, resistant, shifting, sometimes soft, sometimes hard, and often unpredictable underfoot. Every step required the body to respond, not in a dramatic way, but through constant small adjustments that kept balance, stability, and movement in alignment. Walking was not a passive action. It involved the feet adapting to irregular surfaces, the ankles stabilizing against subtle changes, the knees absorbing variations in terrain, and the hips and spine coordinating to maintain forward motion. This continuous interaction with the ground created a form of resistance that was always present, not intense, but persistent. It shaped how muscles were engaged, not by demanding maximum effort, but by requiring constant participation. In this context, strength was not built only through heavy exertion. It was maintained through repeated exposure to low-level resistance that never fully disappeared. The ground itself acted as a quiet source of training, one that did not need to be scheduled or intensified, because it was embedded in every movement. Over time, this kind of resistance supported the body's ability to maintain stability and strength without conscious effort. In contrast, modern environments often remove much of this natural resistance. Surfaces are made flat, predictable, and supportive. Footwear reduces direct contact with the ground, absorbing impact and smoothing irregularities. Paths are designed to minimize variation, allowing movement to occur with less need for constant adjustment. These changes do not eliminate movement, but they alter its quality. The body no longer receives the same continuous feedback from the ground, and the small adjustments that once occurred with every step become less frequent. Without this constant interaction, the muscles that support balance and stability may be engaged less consistently, and over time, this can influence how strength is maintained. Before 40, the body often compensates for this reduction in natural resistance. Movement still occurs, and the system adapts to maintain function even when the underlying engagement has shifted. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of reduced interaction with the environment may become more noticeable. The body may feel less stable under certain conditions, or movements that once required no thought may begin to require more attention. This does not indicate a sudden loss of ability, but it reflects the long-term absence of the subtle resistance that once supported continuous engagement. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the effects of this absence begin to align in a way that is more consistently felt. In earlier conditions, the ground was not simply a surface to move across. It was an active part of the environment that shaped how the body functioned. Every step reinforced the connection between movement and stability, maintaining a level of engagement that supported strength without requiring deliberate effort. In modern conditions, where the ground has been made more uniform and less demanding, this connection is altered. The body still moves, but it does so within a context that provides less continuous challenge, and this can influence how strength is distributed over time. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood in part through this change, where the removal of natural resistance leads to a gradual shift in how the body maintains its capacity. Strength does not disappear, but the conditions that once sustained it quietly through constant interaction with the environment are no longer present in the same form. As a result, the body adapts, and this adaptation becomes more visible as time passes, particularly around 40, when the accumulated effects of reduced environmental engagement begin to shape how movement feels and how strength is expressed within a system that was originally formed in constant contact with a world that never stood still. When the ground no longer provides continuous resistance, the body begins to receive less information about how it is positioned and how it should respond to movement. In earlier environments, each step offered subtle feedback. The texture, firmness, and unevenness of the surface communicated directly with the feet and through them with the rest of the body. This feedback guided small adjustments in balance, posture, and coordination, keeping the system engaged without requiring conscious effort. The body did not need to think about maintaining stability, because the environment constantly required it to do so. Over time, this ongoing interaction helped maintain a network of responses that supported strength in a quiet but persistent way. When this feedback becomes reduced, the body does not lose its ability to respond, but it receives fewer signals that prompt continuous adjustment. Smooth, predictable surfaces limit the need for variation, and supportive footwear reduces the range of sensation reaching the feet. As a result, the body may rely less on the small, stabilizing actions that once occurred naturally. These actions do not disappear entirely, but they become less frequent, and over time, this change can influence how strength is maintained across the system. Before 40, the body often adapts to this reduced feedback without making the difference obvious. Movement still occurs, balance is maintained, and the system continues to function. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of reduced environmental input may begin to appear more clearly. The body may feel less responsive in certain situations, or stability may require more attention than it once did. This does not indicate a sudden loss, but it reflects the gradual reduction of the signals that once supported continuous engagement. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the long-term effects of reduced feedback begin to align in a way that is more consistently noticeable. In earlier human conditions, the body was rarely separated from the variability of the environment. Each movement reinforced the connection between sensation and response, maintaining a level of readiness that did not depend on deliberate practice. In modern conditions, where the environment is designed to be more stable and less demanding, this connection is altered. The body still responds when needed, but it may not be prompted to maintain the same level of continuous adjustment. Over time, this can lead to a shift in how strength is distributed, making it less tied to constant low-level engagement and more dependent on specific situations. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this gradual shift, where the reduction in environmental feedback leads to a change in how the body maintains its internal balance. Strength does not disappear, but it may become less integrated into everyday movement and more dependent on deliberate use. This change becomes more visible as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of reduced interaction with the environment has had enough time to influence how movement feels and how stability is maintained. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not only the absence of physical resistance, but also the absence of continuous feedback that once guided the body's responses. Within a system that was shaped to remain in constant communication with a world that required it to adjust with every step, as this quiet stream of resistance and feedback fades from daily life, the body does not simply become weaker in a direct way. It begins to change how it organizes strength across the whole system. In earlier conditions, strength was not concentrated in isolated moments or specific movements. It was distributed across countless small actions that were repeated without interruption. The feet adjusted to the ground, the legs stabilized the body with each step, the core responded to shifts in balance, and the upper body coordinated to maintain alignment. None of these actions required high intensity, but together they created a continuous network of engagement that supported strength in a way that was both stable and resilient. When the environment no longer demands these constant adjustments, the body begins to simplify its patterns. Movements become more uniform, less varied, and more predictable. This simplification reduces the need for certain types of muscular engagement, especially those that are involved in fine control and subtle stabilization. Over time, this does not remove strength entirely, but it changes where strength is maintained and how it is expressed. Instead of being spread across many small systems working together, strength may become more localized, appearing in specific movements while other areas become less engaged. Before 40, the body often manages this redistribution without making it obvious. It continues to perform, and the absence of continuous variation remains largely unnoticed. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of this simplification may begin to show. Movements that once felt integrated may begin to feel more segmented, requiring more conscious coordination, and the body may feel less stable when faced with unfamiliar or uneven conditions. This does not mean that strength has been lost in a sudden way, but it reflects a gradual reorganization that has taken place over time. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the long-term effects of reduced variation and resistance begin to align in a way that is more consistently experienced. In earlier human environments, variability was unavoidable. The ground was uneven, the load was not standardized, and movement required constant adaptation. This variability ensured that strength was maintained across a wide range of conditions, not because it was deliberately trained, but because it was continuously required. In modern environments where variability is often reduced, the body adapts by narrowing the range of conditions it regularly encounters. This narrowing influences how strength is distributed, making it more specific and less general. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this narrowing process, where the reduction of environmental complexity leads to a more limited pattern of engagement. Strength does not disappear, but it becomes less integrated into the full range of movement that once supported it. As a result, the body may feel less capable in situations that fall outside its regular patterns, and this feeling becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of reduced variation has had enough time to influence how movement is coordinated and how strength is applied. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not only a reduction in resistance, but a narrowing of the conditions under which strength is maintained. Within a system that was originally shaped to operate across a wide and unpredictable range of environmental demands, and that continues to carry that expectation even as the world becomes more stable and less varied. As the environment becomes more controlled and less demanding, the role of comfort begins to shape how the body experiences effort. Comfort is often understood as the absence of strain, a state in which the body can remain at ease without needing to respond to external pressure. In modern life, this state is extended across large portions of the day through stable surfaces, supportive seating, controlled temperatures, and tools that reduce the need for physical exertion. These conditions do not remove movement entirely, but they reduce the number of situations in which the body must adjust continuously. In earlier human environments, comfort existed in a different form. It was not a constant condition, but a temporary relief within a landscape that regularly required engagement. Sitting did not fully remove the need for muscular support. Lying down did not eliminate all pressure from the body, and even moments of rest were shaped by the surrounding terrain and climate. This meant that the body rarely entered a state of complete ease. There was always a degree of involvement, a subtle demand that kept the system active even when it appeared to be at rest. Within this structure, the body did not need to switch between effort and comfort in a sharp way. It remained within a continuous range where both could coexist. When comfort becomes more complete and more constant, the body adapts by reducing the level of engagement it maintains during these periods. Muscles relax more fully, joints experience less variation, and the systems that support movement are allowed to settle into a lower state of activity. This adaptation conserves energy, but it also changes how the body prepares for effort. Instead of remaining partially engaged, the body may need to transition more noticeably from a state of comfort to a state of movement. Before 40, These transitions are often smooth enough that they do not draw attention. The body moves from rest to activity with little difficulty, and the difference between continuous engagement and complete relaxation remains subtle. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of extended comfort may begin to appear more clearly. Movements that once felt immediate may require a brief period of adjustment, and the body may feel less prepared to respond without some form of gradual activation. This does not indicate that comfort is harmful in itself, but it reflects how the body adapts to the conditions it experiences most often. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the long-term influence of extended comfort becomes more visible. In earlier conditions, the body rarely experienced long periods of complete ease, and as a result, it maintained a baseline of readiness that supported continuous movement. In modern conditions, where comfort can be sustained for extended periods, this baseline may shift, leading to a change in how strength is accessed and maintained. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this context as a reflection of how the body responds when comfort becomes the dominant condition. Strength does not disappear, but the pathway to expressing it becomes more dependent on transitioning out of a deeper state of relaxation. Over time, these transitions can influence how strength feels, making it seem less immediate and more variable. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not only changes in movement and environment, but also the increasing presence of comfort as a defining condition of daily life. Within a system that was originally shaped to operate with less separation between ease and effort, and that continues to carry that structure even as the balance between them shifts, when comfort becomes the dominant condition of daily life, the body begins to reinterpret what is necessary for maintaining strength. In earlier environments, ease was temporary and often incomplete, and because of that, the body remained quietly active even during moments that appeared restful. There was always a subtle demand placed on posture, on balance, on the small adjustments required to stay aligned with an uneven world. These demands did not feel like effort, but they ensured that the body never fully disengaged from the processes that support movement. When comfort becomes more complete, these subtle demands begin to disappear. Surfaces support the body more evenly, reducing the need for constant adjustment. Tools and environments are designed to minimize strain, allowing the body to settle into positions that require less active maintenance. Over time, the body adapts to this reduction in demand by lowering the level of background engagement it maintains. This does not happen suddenly, and it does not remove the ability to move, but it changes how much the body prepares itself in advance of movement. Instead of remaining partially active, the body may rest more fully, conserving energy but also reducing the continuous signals that once supported strength. Before 40, this shift often remains subtle. The body still responds when movement is required, and the difference between continuous engagement and deeper relaxation may not be immediately noticeable. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of this reduced engagement may begin to shape how the body feels more consistently. Movements that once required little preparation may now feel more dependent on a gradual return to activity, and the body may appear less ready to respond without some form of transition. This does not indicate that comfort itself causes weakness, but it reflects how the body adapts to the conditions it experiences most often. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the long-term influence of sustained comfort becomes more visible, not because it marks a sudden change, but because it reveals the outcome of many small adjustments made over time. In earlier human conditions, the body rarely entered a state of complete ease, and as a result it maintained a steady level of readiness that supported continuous movement. In modern conditions, where comfort can be prolonged and complete, this readiness may shift, becoming more conditional and less constant. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this framework as a reflection of how the body responds when the signals that once maintained continuous engagement are reduced. Strength does not disappear, but it becomes less embedded in everyday posture and more dependent on specific moments of use. Over time, this can create a sense that strength is less stable, even though the capacity remains. This sense becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of reduced background engagement has had enough time to influence how movement begins and how effort is sustained. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not a single cause, but a gradual shift in how the body organizes itself around comfort within a system that was originally shaped to operate with constant, low-level demand, and that continues to respond to the presence or absence of that demand, even as the conditions of daily life become more controlled and less physically demanding. As comfort continues to shape the body's daily experience, it does not simply reduce effort, it gradually changes how effort is perceived and how often it is used. In an environment where the body is rarely pushed into complete relaxation, effort exists along a continuous range. Movement rises and falls in intensity, but it never begins from a fully inactive state. This continuity allows the body to engage strength without crossing a sharp boundary, and because of that, effort does not feel sudden or disruptive. It becomes part of a steady flow, something that is distributed across time rather than concentrated into specific moments. When comfort becomes more complete and more sustained, this flow begins to break. The body spends longer periods in a state of minimal engagement, where muscles are fully relaxed, posture is externally supported, and movement is not required to maintain stability. In this state, the body is not preparing for effort in the same way. It conserves energy, but it also reduces the background level of readiness that once made movement feel continuous. As a result, when effort does occur, it emerges from a lower baseline. The difference between rest and activity becomes more pronounced, and this changes how effort is experienced. Tasks that once felt like a natural extension of movement may now feel like a transition, something that requires a shift rather than a continuation. Before 40, the body often absorbs this change without making it obvious. Strength is still available, and movement still occurs, but the underlying pattern has already shifted. The body is no longer maintaining the same continuous engagement, even if the difference is not yet fully visible. Around 40, the cumulative effect of this shift begins to appear more clearly. Effort may feel heavier, not because it requires more energy, but because it is being drawn from a state of deeper relaxation. Recovery may feel less immediate, not because the body cannot restore itself, but because it must first re-establish the conditions that support that restoration. This creates a subtle but consistent change in how strength is experienced, one that becomes more noticeable over time. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the long-term influence of sustained comfort begins to align into a pattern that can be felt across different types of movement. In earlier human environments, the body was rarely separated from physical demand in such a complete way. Even during rest, there was a level of engagement that kept the system connected to movement. This connection reduced the gap between effort and recovery, allowing strength to remain part of a continuous process. In modern conditions, where comfort creates a clearer separation between inactivity and activity, this connection weakens. Strength may still exist, but it is no longer embedded in everyday movement in the same way. It becomes something that must be accessed, rather than something that is always present in the background. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this gradual shift, where the body adapts to prolonged comfort by lowering its baseline of engagement. Over time, this lowers the frequency with which strength is used, and because strength depends on use to be maintained, it begins to feel less stable. This does not mean that the body is failing, but it reflects how the conditions that once supported continuous engagement have changed. As the body approaches 40, the accumulated effect of these changes becomes more visible, not as a sudden loss, but as a gradual difference in how effort feels and how strength is expressed within a system that was originally shaped to operate in a world where comfort was temporary and where movement remained part of an unbroken experience. When the pattern of strength begins to shift across time, it does not happen within a single life alone, but across many generations that experience similar changes in environment. The human body does not reset itself completely with each new generation. It carries forward tendencies, responses, and ways of allocating energy that were shaped over long periods, and these tendencies continue to interact with new conditions as they appear. When environments change gradually, the body has time to adjust, and patterns of strength, movement, and recovery evolve in ways that remain aligned with daily life. When environments change more quickly, as they have in recent human history, the body does not immediately reorganize its deeper systems. Instead, it continues to operate within structures that were formed under earlier conditions, even as the surface of life begins to look very different. This creates a situation where each generation may live within a slightly altered pattern, one that is not entirely new, but not fully aligned with what came before. Over time, these small shifts can accumulate, shaping how strength is expressed without creating a clear moment of change. In earlier human conditions, the demands placed on the body remained relatively consistent across generations. Movement was required, environments were variable, and the relationship between effort and survival remained stable. This continuity allowed strength to be maintained within a pattern that did not need to be redefined frequently. In modern conditions, however, each generation may experience a slightly different structure of life, with changes in work, movement, environment, and daily rhythm. These changes do not remove the body's capacity for strength, but they influence how often that capacity is used and how it is maintained. Before 40, individuals often adapt to the conditions they grow up in, developing strength in ways that reflect their environment. Around 40, the accumulated effect of those conditions may begin to appear more clearly, not because the body suddenly changes, but because the long-term pattern of use has reached a point where it shapes everyday experience. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a stage where generational patterns become visible within an individual life. It reflects not only personal history, but the broader context in which that history has unfolded. If the conditions that support continuous movement and engagement have been reduced over several generations, the body may begin each life with a slightly different baseline, one that still carries older structures but operates within newer constraints. This does not suggest a fixed decline from one generation to the next, but it points toward a gradual shift in how strength is distributed and maintained. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this framework as a reflection of how generational change influences the body's patterns of use. Strength is not lost at a single point, and it is not determined by a single cause, but it is shaped by how each generation interacts with its environment over time. When those environments consistently reduce the need for continuous engagement, the body adapts, and this adaptation becomes part of the pattern that is carried forward. As a result, the experience of weakening before 40 may not be entirely new, but it may be becoming more noticeable as the gap between older biological tendencies and newer environmental conditions continues to widen. In this way, the body reflects not only the life it is living, but the conditions that have shaped that life across generations within a system that evolves slowly, even as the world around it changes more rapidly. When these generational shifts continue over time, they do not produce a clear break between one pattern of strength and another, but they gradually reshape what the body comes to recognize as normal. Each generation grows within the conditions it is given, adapting to the level of movement, the type of environment, and the rhythm of daily life that surrounds it. This adaptation happens early, often before it is consciously noticed, and it sets a baseline for how strength is developed and maintained. If the environment provides continuous low-level demand, the body integrates that demand into its structure, building strength in a way that remains active across time. If the environment reduces that demand, the body adapts by organizing itself around a lower level of engagement, still capable, but less continuously reinforced. Over several generations, this difference can become more consistent, not as a sudden loss, but as a gradual redefinition of what is typical. The body does not lose its potential, but the way that potential is expressed depends on the conditions in which it develops. Before 40, individuals often function within the baseline they have inherited through both their own experience and the broader pattern of their environment. Strength is present, and movement is possible, but the underlying level of continuous engagement may already be lower than it was in earlier conditions. Around 40, the accumulated effect of this baseline begins to appear more clearly. What once felt stable may begin to feel more variable, not because something has suddenly changed, but because the long-term pattern has reached a point where its effects can no longer remain in the background. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where generational influence becomes visible within individual experience. It reflects the intersection of personal adaptation and inherited patterns, shaped by the environments that have guided movement over time. In earlier human conditions, where the demands of life remained relatively stable across generations, this baseline did not shift as dramatically. The body developed within a consistent framework, and strength was maintained within that continuity. In modern conditions, where environments change more rapidly, the body may not fully adjust its deeper systems at the same pace. Instead, it continues to operate within structures formed under earlier conditions, while adapting at the surface level to new patterns of use. This creates a layered effect, where older tendencies and newer conditions interact, influencing how strength is experienced over time. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this layered structure, where the body reflects both its long-term formation and its more recent environment. Strength does not disappear suddenly, and it is not defined by a single moment, but it is shaped by how consistently it is used across time, both within a single life and across generations. When continuous engagement becomes less common, the body adapts, and this adaptation becomes part of the pattern that is carried forward. As a result, the experience of weakening before 40 may become more noticeable, not because the body has changed abruptly, but because the conditions that once supported its continuous maintenance have been gradually reduced. In this way, the body expresses a history that extends beyond individual experience, revealing how strength is influenced by the accumulation of small shifts that occur over many generations within a system that responds slowly to change, even as the world around it evolves more quickly. As these layered patterns continue to accumulate across generations, the body begins to carry a quiet memory of past conditions while functioning within a present that no longer fully matches them. This memory is not conscious, and it does not appear as a clear instruction, but it shapes how the body responds to movement, to effort, and to the absence of both. Over time, the difference between what the body expects and what it receives can create a gradual shift in how strength is expressed. The body may still follow pathways that were formed under continuous demand, but when those pathways are activated less often, they begin to change in subtle ways. Strength remains possible, but it is no longer reinforced with the same consistency, and without that reinforcement, it may feel less stable across time. Before 40, this difference often remains within a range that does not disrupt daily function. The body adapts, using what is required and conserving what is not, and the underlying shift remains largely unexamined. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of this generational memory and present condition begins to take on a more defined shape. The body may feel as though it is responding to a different set of expectations than the mind holds, and this can create a sense that strength is not being maintained in the way it should be. This feeling does not arise from a single change, but from the interaction between long-standing patterns and current conditions. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where this interaction becomes more visible, not because it introduces something new, but because it reveals the outcome of processes that have been unfolding for a long time. In earlier human environments, the alignment between expectation and condition was closer. The body developed within a context that matched the demands it would continue to face, and strength was maintained within that continuity. In modern environments, where the structure of daily life has shifted across generations, this alignment is less precise. The body continues to operate within frameworks that were shaped by earlier demands, while the present provides fewer opportunities to reinforce those frameworks. This creates a gradual divergence, one that does not break the system, but alters how it functions over time. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this divergence, where the body's inherited tendencies meet an environment that does not fully support their expression. Strength is not removed, but it may become less consistently integrated into daily life, and this can make it feel as though it is diminishing earlier than expected. This process does not occur suddenly, and it does not depend on a single cause, but it reflects the accumulation of many small differences between past and present conditions. As the body approaches 40, these differences become more apparent, not because the body has reached a limit, but because the gap between its long-term formation and its current environment has widened enough to be felt. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects a deeper continuity across generations, one in which the body carries forward patterns that were shaped under different circumstances, and gradually reveals how those patterns interact with a world that has changed more quickly than the systems that sustain them. Even as environments change and generations adapt, the body continues to respond to a set of signals that were shaped long before modern life created new patterns of movement and rest. These signals are subtle, but they guide how the body allocates energy, maintains tissue, and responds to effort over time. They do not operate with awareness, and they are not fixed to a specific place or culture, but they reflect conditions that were once consistent across long periods of human history. Movement, variation in terrain, exposure to changing temperatures, irregular effort, and the need for constant adjustment all formed a background of signals that the body learned to interpret as normal. Within that background, strength was maintained because it was continuously required, and the systems that supported it remained active as long as those signals were present. When these signals begin to change, the body does not immediately reorganize itself. It continues to respond according to patterns that were established under earlier conditions, even if the current environment provides different inputs. This creates a situation where the body may receive fewer signals that support continuous engagement, while still operating under the assumption that such signals are important. Over time, this difference can influence how strength is maintained, not by removing it directly, but by altering the frequency and consistency with which it is reinforced. Before 40, the body often compensates for this difference. It maintains function, adapts to new conditions, and continues to respond when movement is required. The absence of certain signals may not be immediately noticeable, because the body is capable of adjusting within a wide range of conditions. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of this altered signal environment may begin to appear more clearly. The body may feel less responsive in certain situations, or it may require more consistent engagement to maintain the same level of strength. This does not indicate a sudden change, but it reflects the outcome of a long-term shift in the signals that guide the body's behavior. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where these shifts become more visible, not because it creates the change, but because it reveals how the body has been responding over time to a different set of conditions. In earlier human environments, the signals that supported strength were embedded in daily life. The need to move, to adapt to uneven ground, to respond to temperature changes, and to maintain awareness of the surroundings all contributed to a continuous pattern of engagement. In modern environments, many of these signals are reduced or altered. Surfaces are stable, temperatures are controlled, movement can be limited, and the need for constant adjustment is diminished. The body still functions within these conditions, but it may not receive the same level of input that once supported continuous strength. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this gradual change in signals. When the body receives fewer cues that require ongoing engagement, it may adapt by reducing the level of maintenance it performs in the background. Strength remains possible, but it may become less consistently supported, leading to a sense that it is not as stable as it once was. This sense becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of altered signals has had enough time to influence how the system responds. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not only changes in movement or environment, but changes in the signals that guide the body's internal processes. Within a system that continues to follow patterns formed under conditions that are no longer fully present, and that gradually reveals how those patterns adapt when the signals that once sustained them begin to fade. When these older signals become less frequent, the body does not immediately recognize their absence as a problem. It simply adjusts to the pattern that is most consistently present. This adjustment happens slowly, without drawing attention, and over time it begins to reshape how the body interprets what is necessary to maintain strength. In earlier conditions, signals were not only constant, but also varied. Movement did not follow a fixed routine, surfaces changed from step to step, and the environment did not remain stable for long. This variability meant that the body was always receiving new information, prompting continuous adjustment across muscles, joints, and coordination. Strength in this setting was not maintained through repetition alone, but through adaptation to changing conditions. Each variation acted as a small demand, keeping the system responsive across a wide range of possibilities. When this range begins to narrow, the body adapts by focusing on what it encounters most often. It does not attempt to maintain readiness for conditions that no longer appear regularly. Instead, it becomes more efficient within a smaller set of patterns, conserving energy by reinforcing only the responses that are frequently required. This process does not remove strength, but it changes how broadly that strength is distributed across different situations. Before 40, this narrowing of signals often remains difficult to detect. The body continues to perform within the patterns it has adapted to, and because those patterns match daily life, the system appears stable. Movements feel familiar, effort is manageable, and the absence of variation does not immediately create a sense of loss. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of this narrowing begins to show in more consistent ways. The body may feel less prepared when movement falls outside of its usual range, and tasks that require unfamiliar coordination or balance may feel more demanding than they once did. This does not indicate that the body has lost its ability to respond, but it reflects the long-term influence of reduced variation in the signals that guide its behavior. The number 40 becomes relevant here not as a boundary, but as a point where these accumulated adaptations become more visible in everyday experience. In earlier human environments, the body was continuously exposed to unpredictable conditions. Terrain shifted, loads varied, and movement required constant adjustment. This unpredictability ensured that strength was maintained across a wide spectrum, not because it was intentionally trained, but because it was constantly required. The body did not specialize narrowly, because the environment did not allow for narrow specialization. In modern conditions, where environments are more controlled and predictable, the body adapts differently. It becomes more efficient within familiar patterns, but less engaged with variation. This efficiency supports daily function, but it also reduces the need to maintain strength across a broader range of movement. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this gradual narrowing of signals. When the body is no longer required to respond to varied conditions, it adapts by reducing the breadth of its engagement. Strength does not disappear, but it becomes more specific, tied to the patterns that are most frequently used. Over time, this specificity can create a sense that strength is less stable, especially when the body is placed in situations that fall outside of its usual experience. This sense becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of reduced variation has had enough time to influence how movement is organized and how strength is applied. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects a shift not in the existence of strength, but in its range. The body continues to function within the signals it receives, but when those signals become limited, the system adapts by narrowing its responses. This adaptation is gradual, consistent, and shaped over many years, within a structure that was originally formed to respond to constant variation, and that continues to reveal the effects of reduced variation as time passes. As this narrowing of signals continues over time, the body does not only adjust what it maintains, it also begins to adjust what it expects. And this shift in expectation quietly reshapes how strength is organized and expressed. In an environment where variation is constant, the body anticipates change even when none is immediately present, maintaining a wide range of readiness that allows it to respond without delay. It prepares for uneven ground, shifting loads, changes in direction, and subtle instability, keeping many small systems active even when they are not being fully used. This anticipation is not conscious, but it forms part of the background state in which movement takes place, allowing strength to remain distributed across the body rather than concentrated in a narrow set of patterns. When signals become more stable and predictable, this background state begins to change. The body no longer receives frequent reminders that variation is likely, and over time, it reduces the level of readiness it maintains for conditions that rarely occur. This reduction is gradual, and it does not remove the ability to respond, but it changes how easily that response can be accessed when it is needed. Strength remains present, but it becomes more closely tied to familiar movements and less prepared for unfamiliar demands. Before 40, this shift often remains subtle. The body continues to function within the patterns it encounters most often, and because those patterns are sufficient for daily life, the narrowing of readiness does not immediately create a sense of loss. Movements feel normal, effort is manageable, and the system appears stable. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of this reduced anticipation begins to appear more consistently. The body may feel less responsive when movement requires adaptation beyond familiar conditions, and tasks that involve balance, coordination, or unexpected variation may feel more demanding than they once did. This does not indicate that strength has been removed, but it reflects a change in how the body prepares for movement, shaped by years of operating within a more predictable environment. The number 40 becomes relevant here not as a fixed boundary, but as a point where the long-term effects of reduced variation and reduced anticipation become easier to notice. In earlier human environments, anticipation was necessary for survival. The body could not rely on stability, and it needed to remain prepared for change at all times. This requirement kept a wide range of responses active, even when they were not being used directly. Strength, in this context, was not only about producing force, but about maintaining the ability to respond across many different situations without delay. In modern environments, where stability is more common and variation is reduced, this requirement becomes less constant. The body adapts by narrowing its readiness, focusing on the patterns it encounters most frequently, and conserving energy by reducing engagement in systems that are rarely called upon. Over time, this adaptation influences how strength is distributed, making it more specific and less broadly maintained. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this gradual shift in expectation, where the body no longer prepares for the same range of conditions it once did. Strength does not disappear, but it becomes less immediately available outside of familiar patterns, and this can create the sense that it is diminishing earlier than expected. This sense becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of reduced anticipation has had enough time to influence how movement is organized and how effort is experienced. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not a sudden decline, but a change in how the body prepares for the world around it. Within a system that was originally shaped to expect constant variation, and that gradually reveals the effects of reduced variation as the conditions of life become more stable over time. When strength is not used regularly across a wide range of movement, it does not disappear in a clear or immediate way. It changes more quietly, becoming less present in the background of daily life. The body does not remove capacity all at once, and it does not treat unused strength as something that must be lost, but it gradually reduces how much of that capacity is maintained at all times. In earlier environments, where movement was constant and varied, strength was continuously reinforced, not through deliberate effort, but through repeated use across many small actions. Walking, carrying, adjusting balance, and responding to uneven conditions all contributed to a steady level of engagement that supported strength without interruption. This meant that strength was not something that had to be rebuilt. It was something that remained active because it was always being used. When this pattern changes, and strength is used less frequently or within a narrower range, the body adapts by shifting how it maintains that capacity. It does not assume that unused strength needs to be preserved indefinitely, and over time, it reduces the level of support it provides to systems that are not regularly engaged. This reduction is gradual, and it does not remove the ability to produce strength when required, but it changes how easily that strength can be accessed. Before 40, the body often compensates for this change, maintaining function even when the underlying level of continuous support has begun to shift. Movements still occur, and strength can still be applied, but the background presence of strength may begin to feel less consistent. Around 40, the accumulated effect of reduced use becomes more noticeable, not because the body has suddenly lost its capacity, but because the difference between continuous reinforcement and intermittent use has had enough time to influence how strength is maintained. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the long-term effects of reduced use begin to appear more clearly in everyday experience. In earlier human conditions, the body rarely experienced prolonged periods without varied movement. Even during rest, there was some level of engagement that helped maintain strength across different systems. In modern conditions, where movement can be limited and repetitive, the body adapts by focusing on the patterns it encounters most often and reducing support for those that are less frequently used. This creates a form of strength that is more specific, more dependent on recent activity, and less integrated across the full range of possible movement. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this framework as a reflection of how the body responds to reduced use over time. Strength does not vanish, but it becomes less stable when it is not continuously reinforced. This instability may not be immediately obvious, but it becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of intermittent use has had enough time to shape how strength is experienced. Tasks that once felt effortless may require more attention, and the body may feel less prepared for demands that fall outside of its regular patterns. This does not indicate failure, but it reflects how the body adapts to the conditions it experiences most often. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 can be seen not as a sudden decline, but as the result of how strength is used, or not used, over long periods of time within a system that continues to respond to patterns of engagement and that gradually reveals the effects of reduced use as the body moves further along its internal timeline. When strength is used less often, the body does not immediately lose its ability to produce force, but it begins to change how that force is supported over time. The systems that allow strength to feel stable in everyday movement depend not only on capacity, but on constant reinforcement. In earlier human conditions, this reinforcement was built into daily life. Movement was frequent, varied, and unavoidable, and because of that, the body did not need to decide when to maintain strength. It simply responded to the demands placed on it, and through that response, strength remained integrated into a wide range of actions. When use becomes less frequent, this integration begins to loosen. The body still retains the ability to produce strength when required, but it may no longer maintain that ability at the same level of readiness across all situations. Instead, it begins to rely more heavily on recent activity, reinforcing what is used and allowing what is not used to gradually recede into a lower level of support. This process is not abrupt, and it does not remove strength in a direct way, but it changes how consistently strength is present in the background of movement. Before 40, this shift often remains subtle. The body continues to perform, and the difference between continuous reinforcement and intermittent use may only appear in specific situations. Strength may still be accessible, but it may feel less stable when the body is asked to perform outside of its usual patterns. Around 40, the accumulated effect of this reduced reinforcement becomes more noticeable. The body may begin to require more consistent engagement to maintain the same level of function, and without that engagement, strength may feel less reliable across different types of movement. This does not indicate that the body has lost its capacity, but it reflects how the systems that support strength depend on regular input to remain stable. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the long-term effects of reduced reinforcement begin to shape everyday experience. In earlier environments, the body rarely experienced long periods without varied movement, and as a result, strength remained broadly supported across different systems. In modern conditions, where movement can be repetitive and limited, the body adapts by reinforcing specific patterns while reducing support for others. This creates a form of strength that is more dependent on routine and less adaptable to variation. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this framework as a reflection of how reduced reinforcement influences the stability of strength over time. Strength does not disappear, but it becomes less evenly distributed, and this unevenness can make it feel as though it is diminishing earlier than expected. Tasks that once required no preparation may begin to require more deliberate engagement, and the body may feel less prepared to respond across a wide range of conditions. This change becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of intermittent use has had enough time to influence how strength is organized and maintained. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not a sudden loss, but a gradual change in how strength is supported within a system that continues to respond to patterns of use, and that reveals the effects of reduced reinforcement as those patterns become more limited over time. When strength is used only in specific moments rather than woven into continuous activity, the body begins to separate capacity from familiarity, and over time this separation changes how strength is experienced. The ability to produce force may still exist, but the ease with which it can be expressed across different situations becomes less consistent. In earlier human environments, strength was not something that needed to be accessed from a resting state. It was already present within the flow of movement, supported by constant low-level engagement that kept muscles, coordination, and balance active. Because of this, strength felt stable, not because it was always at its peak, but because it was continuously reinforced through use. When this pattern changes and strength is used intermittently, the body adapts by linking strength more closely to recent activity. Systems that are frequently engaged remain supported, while those that are used less often gradually receive less reinforcement. This does not remove the underlying capacity, but it changes how broadly that capacity is distributed across movement. Strength becomes more specific, more dependent on context, and less integrated into the full range of everyday activity. Before 40, this shift often remains subtle, because the body is still able to respond effectively within familiar patterns. Movements that are repeated regularly continue to feel stable, and the reduction in broader reinforcement may not be immediately noticeable. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of this separation between capacity and familiarity begins to appear more clearly. The body may feel less prepared for movements that fall outside of its regular patterns, and strength may seem less reliable when applied in unfamiliar ways. This does not indicate that strength has disappeared, but it reflects how the body has reorganized its support systems over time. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the long-term effects of intermittent use and reduced integration become more consistently visible. In earlier human conditions, the body rarely needed to separate strength from daily movement, because movement itself provided continuous reinforcement across a wide range of conditions. In modern conditions, where movement can be limited, repetitive, or optional, the body adapts by maintaining strength where it is needed most frequently, while allowing other areas to settle into a lower level of support. This creates a form of strength that is more concentrated and less evenly distributed, which can influence how it is experienced in everyday life. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood through this gradual process, where the separation between capacity and familiarity leads to a change in how strength is perceived. Strength may still be present, but if it is not consistently integrated into a wide range of movement, it may feel less stable and less available when needed. This feeling becomes more noticeable as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of reduced integration has had enough time to shape how movement is organized and how effort is experienced. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not a sudden loss of ability, but a gradual narrowing of how strength is used and supported within a system that continues to respond to patterns of engagement, and that reveals the effects of reduced variation and reinforcement as those patterns become more limited over time, leading to a form of strength that is still present but less continuously accessible across the full range of human movement. When human life began to extend beyond what earlier conditions consistently supported, the body did not immediately change the way it managed its strength. It continued to follow patterns that had been shaped under a shorter and less predictable timeline. This extension of life did not come from a sudden transformation in the body's internal systems, but from changes in the surrounding world, safer conditions, more stable access to food, reduced exposure to certain forms of risk, and a gradual shift in how survival was structured. As these changes accumulated, people began to live further beyond 40 with greater consistency, and over time, this created a new expectation, one in which strength was assumed to remain stable across a longer portion of life. However, the body itself had not been fully reorganized to match this extended expectation. It still carried patterns of allocation, use, and recovery that were formed when the future was less certain and when maintaining strength far beyond 40 was not consistently reinforced by the conditions of life. This creates a quiet divergence between how long life lasts and how the body distributes its resources across that lifespan. Before 40, the body often operates within the range where its patterns of investment are most strongly supported. Growth, movement, and early adult function receive consistent reinforcement, and strength is maintained within this phase with relative stability. As the body moves closer to 40, the allocation of resources may begin to shift, not because the body is failing, but because its internal systems are not structured to maintain the same level of continuous reinforcement indefinitely without consistent signals to do so. In earlier conditions, this shift may not have been experienced as a loss, because life itself did not extend far beyond that point for many individuals. In modern conditions, where life continues well past 40, the same shift becomes more noticeable, creating the sense that strength is declining earlier than expected. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where this divergence becomes visible, where the body's older pattern of resource allocation meets a newer expectation of extended stability. This does not mean that the body is unable to maintain strength beyond 40, but it suggests that doing so may require conditions that are not automatically provided by modern life. In earlier environments, strength was maintained through continuous use, constant variation, and ongoing engagement with the environment. In modern environments, where these conditions may be reduced, the body may not receive the same level of input needed to sustain its earlier patterns of strength without additional support. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this context as a reflection of how the body continues to operate within an older framework while existing within a newer timeline. Strength does not disappear at 40, but the ease with which it is maintained may change, especially if the conditions that once supported it are no longer present in the same way. As life extends further beyond 40, this change becomes more noticeable, not because the body has reached a fixed limit, but because the gap between its internal patterns and the external structure of life has widened. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not only how strength is used and maintained, but how the body adapts to a timeline that has expanded more quickly than the systems that support it, revealing a quiet mismatch between longevity and the patterns of strength that were formed under very different conditions. When the human lifespan extends beyond the conditions that originally shaped the body, the difference does not appear as a sudden disruption, but as a quiet stretching of time that the body must continue to move through without fully redefining its internal structure. And this stretching gradually reveals how strength is maintained within limits that were not originally set for such extended duration. The systems that manage strength were not formed with a clear expectation of preserving the same level of function across many decades under stable and predictable conditions. They developed in response to immediate pressures, allocating energy toward growth, movement, repair, and adaptation within a timeline that was often uncertain and uneven. As modern life extends that timeline, the body does not rebuild these systems from the beginning. It continues to operate within the same underlying logic, distributing resources in ways that reflect older patterns rather than newly extended expectations. And this creates a subtle mismatch that does not stop the body from functioning but gradually changes how strength is maintained across time. Before 40, the body often operates within a phase where its patterns of allocation still align closely with the demands placed upon it. Movement, adaptation, and recovery are supported by processes that have been reinforced through earlier stages of life, and strength feels relatively stable because the body is still within the range where its internal systems are most actively maintained. As the body approaches 40, however, the extended timeline begins to interact more noticeably with these patterns. The body is now operating beyond the period where its systems were most strongly reinforced by continuous demand, and without the same level of ongoing input, the maintenance of strength may begin to require more consistent engagement. Not because the body has reached a limit, but because the conditions that once supported effortless maintenance are no longer present in the same way. This change does not occur suddenly, and it does not follow a single cause, but it reflects the gradual effect of living within a timeline that has expanded faster than the systems that support it. The number 40 becomes relevant in this context, not as a fixed boundary, but as a point where this mismatch begins to be felt more consistently, a stage where the body continues to function within its established patterns, while the surrounding life expects those patterns to remain unchanged for much longer than before. In earlier human environments, life did not consistently extend far beyond this stage, and as a result, the body did not need to maintain peak strength under reduced demand for extended periods. Strength was used, reinforced, and adapted within a narrower and more immediate frame of time, and this allowed the body to remain aligned with the conditions it faced. In modern environments where life extends well beyond 40, the body must continue to function within a framework that was not originally structured for such prolonged stability, and this creates a gradual divergence between expectation and response. Strength remains possible, but it may no longer be sustained in the same effortless way, because the continuous signals that once supported it are less present, and without those signals, the body may reduce the level of background maintenance it performs. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this extended timeline as a reflection of how the body adapts when its original framework is stretched, not by failing, but by continuing to operate within patterns that were formed under different conditions. Over time, this creates a quiet separation between how long life continues and how long strength feels stable without deliberate reinforcement, and this separation becomes more visible as the body approaches 40, when the cumulative effect of extended time has had enough influence to shape how strength is experienced in everyday life. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not a sudden decline, but the gradual unfolding of a mismatch between a longer lifespan and an older biological rhythm within a system that continues to adapt slowly, revealing how strength is influenced not only by use and environment, but by the length of time over which those influences must be sustained within a body that was not originally shaped for such extended continuity. As this extended timeline continues to unfold, the body does not simply stretch its patterns evenly across the added years. It begins to reveal where those patterns were originally concentrated and where they become thinner over time. In earlier conditions, strength was not expected to remain at a constant level across a long and stable future. It was distributed more heavily in the phases of life where movement, adaptation, and reproduction were most directly tied to survival. This distribution was not fixed to a precise age, but it followed a general structure in which earlier years received more consistent reinforcement, while later years depended more on how conditions allowed strength to be maintained. When life extends well beyond 40, this earlier concentration becomes more visible, not because the body suddenly changes, but because the extended timeline allows the difference between earlier and later patterns to be experienced more clearly. Before 40, the body often still operates within the range where its systems have been most actively supported. Movement feels integrated, recovery follows familiar rhythms, and strength appears stable because it is still aligned with the patterns that shaped it. As the body moves beyond this range, the conditions that once supported continuous reinforcement may no longer be present in the same way. And without that reinforcement, the maintenance of strength begins to depend more on deliberate engagement rather than on automatic processes. Around 40, this shift becomes easier to notice, not as a sudden event, but as a gradual change in how strength feels within daily life. Tasks that once required little preparation may begin to require more consistent input, and the body may feel less able to rely on its previous baseline without additional support. This does not indicate that the body has reached a fixed limit, but it reflects how its internal structure distributes strength across time. The number 40 becomes relevant here as a point where the extended timeline begins to reveal the underlying pattern of distribution, showing how strength was once concentrated within a shorter and less predictable span of life. In earlier human environments, this concentration did not create a sense of early decline, because life itself did not consistently extend far beyond that range. Strength was used, adapted, and maintained within the conditions that were present, and there was little expectation that it would remain unchanged across many additional decades. In modern environments where life continues well beyond 40, the same pattern becomes more noticeable, creating the impression that strength is being lost earlier than expected. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this framework as a reflection of how the body distributes its resources across a timeline that has been extended beyond its original structure. Strength does not disappear at a single point, and it is not determined by a single factor, but it becomes more dependent on how consistently it is reinforced as time continues. When the signals that once supported continuous reinforcement are reduced, the body adapts by lowering the level of automatic maintenance it performs, and over time, this creates a difference between earlier and later phases of life that becomes more visible around 40. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects not a sudden decline, but the unfolding of a pattern in which strength was always shaped to be used and reinforced within a shorter frame, and when that frame is extended, the body continues to follow its original distribution while gradually revealing how that distribution interacts with a longer and more stable timeline. When all of these patterns are considered together, the idea of losing strength before 40 begins to shift from a single explanation into a broader structure that reflects how the human body moves through time. Strength is not a fixed resource that is held evenly from one decade to the next. It is shaped by movement, by environment, by the signals the body receives, and by the way those signals are repeated or interrupted across years and generations. Each of these factors contributes quietly, and none of them acts alone. The body does not suddenly decide to weaken before 40, but it follows a set of tendencies that were formed under conditions where life unfolded differently. Movement was continuous, variation was constant, recovery was embedded within activity, and the environment required ongoing adjustment. Within that world, strength remained integrated into daily life, not because it was preserved deliberately, but because it was always in use. When these conditions change, the body adapts, and over time, that adaptation alters how strength is experienced. Before 40, many of these changes remain within a range that does not disrupt daily function. The body continues to respond, to move, and to maintain its capacity within the patterns it has adapted to. Around 40, however, the accumulated effect of these changes begins to align, making the underlying pattern more visible. The body may feel less stable, less responsive, or more dependent on deliberate engagement, not because it has lost its ability, but because the conditions that once supported continuous maintenance are no longer present in the same way. The number 40 becomes meaningful here, not as a boundary, but as a point where multiple long-term processes converge, revealing how strength has been shaped over time. This convergence does not produce a sudden shift, but it creates a consistent sense that something has changed. In earlier human environments, this convergence may not have been experienced in the same way, because life itself did not consistently extend far beyond that stage. The body remained aligned with the conditions it faced, and strength was used and maintained within that alignment. In modern environments where life continues well beyond 40, the same processes become more noticeable, creating the impression that strength is fading earlier than expected. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this broader structure as a reflection of how the body responds to a combination of factors that have gradually shifted over time. It is not a precise measure, and it does not apply in the same way to every individual, but it points toward a pattern that emerges when the body operates within conditions that differ from those under which it was originally shaped. Strength does not disappear at a specific age, and it is not determined by a single cause, but it becomes more dependent on how consistently it is reinforced as life continues. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects a deeper interaction between the body and the passage of time, showing how strength is influenced not only by what the body is capable of, but by the conditions that allow that capability to remain active. When those conditions change, the body adapts, and it is through this adaptation that the early signs of change become visible. Not as a failure, but as a reflection of how the human body continues to carry its past into a present that no longer fully matches it. When these overlapping patterns are brought together, the experience of weakening before 40 begins to lose its sense of unpredictability and instead reveals a kind of internal order, one that is not imposed from outside, but emerges from how the body has been shaped over time. This order is not rigid, and it does not apply in exactly the same way to every individual, but it reflects a consistent relationship between movement, environment, recovery, and the passage of time. The body does not separate these elements, it responds to them as part of a single system, and when one part of that system changes, the others gradually adjust. Over years, these adjustments accumulate, and what is felt around 40 is not a single event, but the point at which multiple gradual changes begin to be experienced together. Movement that has become more limited, recovery that has become more separated from activity, signals from the environment that have become more stable, and a lifespan that has extended beyond earlier conditions all contribute to this convergence. None of these changes alone is enough to explain the experience, but together they form a pattern that shapes how strength is maintained. Before 40, the body often absorbs these differences without making them obvious. It adapts, compensates, and continues to function within the patterns it encounters most often. Around 40, however, the combined effect of these adaptations becomes more consistent. The body may feel less responsive, less stable, or more dependent on deliberate engagement, not because it has lost its ability, but because the balance between use and maintenance has shifted over time. This shift does not appear suddenly, and it does not follow a single cause, but it reflects the accumulation of many small adjustments that have taken place over years, and even across generations. The number 40 becomes meaningful in this context as a point where these adjustments align in a way that is easier to notice. It is not a boundary set by the body, but a stage where the interaction between different factors becomes visible in everyday experience. In earlier human environments, these factors were more closely aligned. Movement, variation, recovery, and environmental signals were integrated into a continuous pattern, and strength was maintained within that continuity. In modern environments, where these elements are more separated, the body adapts by reorganizing how it maintains strength, and this reorganization gradually changes how strength is experienced over time. The idea that many humans may have lost strength before 40 can be understood within this broader structure as a reflection of how the body responds when multiple long-term patterns shift in the same direction. Strength does not disappear at a single moment, and it is not governed by a single factor, but it becomes more dependent on how consistently the conditions that support it are present. When those conditions are reduced or altered, the body adapts, and over time this adaptation creates a sense that strength is less stable than it once was. As the body approaches 40, the cumulative effect of these changes becomes more apparent, not because the body has reached a fixed limit, but because the interaction between its internal patterns and its external conditions has had enough time to shape how movement feels and how strength is expressed. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 reflects a deeper continuity within the human body, one that connects past and present through patterns that adapt slowly, revealing how strength is not only a matter of capability, but of alignment between the body and the world it moves through. When this long sequence of patterns is followed to its quiet end, the experience of weakening before 40 no longer appears as something that must be corrected or resisted, but as something that can be understood as part of a larger relationship between the body and the time it moves through. The body does not exist outside of history, and it does not respond only to the present moment. It carries traces of earlier conditions, patterns of movement, rhythms of effort and recovery, and ways of distributing energy that were formed across long periods in which life unfolded differently. As those conditions change, the body does not immediately abandon what it has learned. It continues to operate within those patterns, adjusting slowly as new signals appear, and it is through this slow adjustment that the experience of change becomes visible. Before 40, much of this process remains quiet. The body adapts without needing to explain itself, maintaining function even as its internal balance shifts in small ways. Around 40, these shifts begin to gather into a form that can be felt more clearly. Strength may no longer feel as constant, movement may require more attention, and recovery may depend more on how the body is engaged. These changes do not signal an end, and they do not define a fixed limit, but they reveal how the body has been shaped by the interaction between past and present conditions. When this is understood, the question of why many humans appear to lose strength before 40 becomes less about identifying a single cause and more about recognizing a pattern that has been unfolding quietly over time. The body is not failing to meet a standard, it is continuing to respond within a structure that was formed under different expectations. Modern life extends the length of that structure, but it does not erase its origins. This creates a space where the body and the timeline of life do not fully align, and it is within this space that the experience of early change emerges. The number 40 remains meaningful not because it marks a boundary, but because it often becomes the point where this misalignment is felt with greater clarity. It is a stage where the accumulation of many small differences becomes visible, where the body begins to show how it has been adapting to a world that has changed more quickly than the systems that support it. This does not mean that strength cannot be maintained beyond 40, or that the body is limited to a narrow path, but it suggests that maintaining strength may depend on how closely the conditions of life align with the patterns that shape the body over time. When movement remains varied, when engagement continues, when recovery is connected to activity, and when the body remains in dialogue with its environment, strength may continue to be supported in ways that feel more stable. When these conditions are reduced, the body adapts, and strength may feel less constant as a result. In this way, the experience of weakening before 40 can be seen not as a fixed outcome, but as a reflection of how the body responds to the conditions it encounters. It is a reminder that strength is not only something the body possesses, but something it maintains through continuous interaction with the world. As life continues beyond 40, the question may not be whether strength can remain the same, but how the relationship between the body and its environment shapes what strength becomes over time, and whether that relationship can ever fully return to the conditions that first gave it form.